Hi, I'm Matthew Rohrs, and this is Scaling What Matters. Human flourishing depends on more than good intentions. It depends on work, capital, and leadership that create real opportunity. At Sinapis, we've spent 15 years serving entrepreneurs exclusively in frontier markets, at the intersection of faith, business, and job creation. This podcast brings together voices shaping that ecosystem, from entrepreneurs and investors to pastors and public leaders. Thanks so much for joining us, and let's jump in. Well, welcome back to Scaling What Matters. Today, I am so excited for a conversation with Karibu Nyaggah, who is one of the co-founders of Sinapis, and he's got an incredible background. He's a serial entrepreneur. He has worked with some of the largest tech firms in the world, like Google and Meta. He's consulted with the World Bank, graduate of Harvard Business School, and is somebody that I've worked closely with and been friends with for a long time. So Karibu, it's fantastic to have you join us.
Thank you for having me, Matthew.
So I think as we begin, building off of a little bit of that background that I just summarized, you found yourself, you were born in Kenya, moved to the US when you were 10, and had a dual Kenyan-American childhood in your citizenship. You fast forward through that, have a lot of success academically, and you get accepted to Harvard Business School. And you're working on an MBA there, and I would love for you to share, because I think people who would hear that would think, okay, all the opportunities in the world are open to you, and yet you choose, with a couple of co-founders, to start Sinapis, move back to Nairobi. So can you tell us about that story? What was going on in your mind? How did you reach those conclusions? Why did you choose to do that?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. So, like you mentioned, I moved to the US when I was 10. But I didn't go back to Kenya really until I was in college. And that first trip going back to Kenya in college was really just almost a homecoming, where you're going with friends and family, and it's a trip down memory lane, and you're reconnecting with old family and old places you've been to. And so it was a good trip.
How long did you go for that trip?
Gosh, can't have been more than a couple of weeks. So went there and then came back, and it was great. It was like, I had a chance to connect with where I was born, and it was fantastic. But then I didn't go back to Kenya again for a few more years. And I remember it was a subsequent trip, and I believe it was before my business school. And on that specific trip, I remember sort of for the first time venturing out on my own while I was in Kenya. Each time I'd always been sort of sponsored by having chaperones with me, whether it was like my cousin or my mom or whoever it was. But I did things in sort of a very just sponsored way. There was always someone. But there was this one time I decided that I wanted to take a trip and just visit my childhood home. And I decided to do it by myself. And so on that trip, I met this lady, and I'm not even necessarily sure how exactly it happened, but I ended up on a matatu. Those are the public transportation in Nairobi that's ubiquitous everywhere. So I ended up on a matatu, and I end up in one of the informal settlements in Kenya. And it was my first time sort of walking through and being exposed to the deep poverty that is in the country.
And how old are you at that time? Because that's probably counterintuitive to somebody hearing this.
Yeah, I'm in my mid-20s at this point.
So the first time you had, like, kind of first person right in front of you experienced that, you're in your mid-20s.
First person, I am, my mind is completely blown away, because in all my time growing up and all these previous trips, I had never been to that part of Nairobi. And it was just completely mind blowing. And I remember two distinct things. I remember ending up at this person's home, and they're kind of just telling me a little bit about their life story. And this young man comes up to me, and he doesn't ask me for money. He actually asks me, "Hey, do you have a job? Do you know anyone who needs a job?" And that stuck with me for a long time because, it's easy to ask for money, but the thing that people really want is a job and a way to sustain themselves. And
how old was that young man probably?
Oh, he was definitely younger than me, maybe in his late teens. Definitely that kind of person who, if you told him I have a construction job, come work for me for a few hours, he's going to come in and put in the time and sweat. And yeah, so that really stuck with me. And then the other thing I remember is just my family's reaction to me venturing out on my own. They were like, "How are you going to make it? Do you really know how to take a matatu? Are you going to be safe?" Just all the fears that you might have of someone who hasn't sort of seen the real side of things, just kind of came up. But as a result of that trip, it really planted something deep in my heart to want to do something about this. And I wasn't sure what or how or when, but I really planted a seed. So that was one component of the story.
Did that happen before business school?
Before business school.
Okay. So you have this really important moment, which again is kind of wild because I don't know, people would probably assume you had firsthand knowledge of this, and you're saying, "No, I didn't." And I mean, I remember in my own journey, it was interesting. I don't know if you were in Kibera, but for me, I was right out of undergrad. And I think it was God's gift to me, but it was just a 24-hour stopover in Nairobi. I'm not sure if I've ever told you this. And we drove by the community in Kibera, and we were kind of on one of the roads up on a hill, and I just saw part of that settlement and all the tin roofs touching, and just tried to imagine what's life like in there. And there's positives and there's negatives, and these are people just like me figuring out how to navigate the ups and downs of life, and that marked me.
It was Kibera, actually. And, I think wherever you live in the world, there tends to be a good part of town and a not so great part of town. And it's really easy to live your whole life never going to the rough side of town. And for me, that's a little bit of how it had been, growing up in Kenya, just never been to that part of town. But what was striking is just the contrast, because I grew up in relatively good home in Kenya and, had a stable family and just I had a lot of the things that were easy to take for granted until you go to a place like Kibera. And so, so it was before business school. One of the thing that kind of happened is, my major in undergrad was in business. And so I told myself, if I'm going to do business school, then I really, I'd had an opportunity to go to Harvard Business School for a summer program and just fell in love with the campus and the people and the professors and everything. And so I sort of told myself that when I could finish when I was finishing undergrad and I, was starting my job, I told myself, when I can look at a business school application and I can answer all the essay questions with integrity, then I'm going to apply. And so I woke up one day and, this was, I want to say it was the year that I applied to business school. It was January. And I remember this so clearly. I was tying my shoes, getting ready to go to work. And it was like this voice very distinctly said, "This is the year you're going to apply to business school." And then I looked at the essays for business school, and I was like, I don't think I can answer all these. It'd been a few years out of school at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And so as I was going through the essay process,
was the answering them just enough experience that you felt like I could reference? I've been working and I've been doing things. It's not just moving from academia to academia.
Yeah, it was questions like, what's your career vision? What do you want to do? What do you want to accomplish? And, coming out of undergrad, I don't know that I had enough life experience to fully answer those questions. But after a few years, I had a pretty good sense. And as I started working on the essays pretty quickly, one of the topics that came to mind was writing about Kenya and me wanting to make a contribution to the country. And I feel like this is a pretty classic pattern of thinking, but there are definitely a few folks who write about, I'm going to go to business school, I'm going to make a lot of money, and then I'm going to turn my attention to giving back. Mm-hmm. And that was a little bit of the arc of what I wrote about. I'm going to go to business school and then get lots of experience in life. And then I'm going to turn my attention to Kenya. And so, I wrote the essays, I got in, and,
what was it like? What was it like finding out that you got in?
Oh, it was nerve-wracking. I think sometimes as people of faith, sometimes we over-spiritualize things. Uh-huh. And I'll give you an example. So 2 days before I found out the news, I think I had a dream that I got into business school. And so I was like, oh, this is great. This is amazing. And then the night before, I had a dream that I didn't get into business school. And so I was like, okay, I have no idea what's going to happen. And then I found out the day of, and it was surreal, honestly. Mm-hmm. It was surreal because I'd never pictured myself as going to Harvard. I never pictured myself as, I'd worked at the essays and the application and all the rest, but you never take it for granted that you can get in. And so when I got in, it was surreal. And then it was pure elation. And I was just excited. Really, really excited. And then when I started, it was like, you have high expectations going in, and that first semester completely blew all those expectations out of the water. I had one thought. So
blew them out of the water. How? It was so much better than you had hoped it would be?
It's way better.
Really? Oh, that's exciting.
Yeah. Just the people you go to business school with are, obviously they're incredibly intelligent, but they're also really nice. And just the friendships that I was developing, the professors were incredible. The learning experience was incredible. Just, it was just a completely different world, and in the first year, they put you into these learning groups where you're paired with sort of 5 other people. So you have a group of 6, and you basically need to sort of help support each other through some of the cases. And it's also just a great way to build friendships. And so it was one morning in Boston that first semester. And I'm walking through the halls just to meet my learning group. And I remember having the distinct thought that I want to take this back to Africa in some way, shape, or form. And the problem with Harvard, or really these great elite schools, is there's not enough space for all the people who could and should be there. Yeah. Right. Harvard is a large school, 900 people per year. But if you think about the continent of Africa and just the incredible range of talent and diversity and, just the wealth, the talent richness of the continent, let alone Asia or Europe or South America, North America, like all the places, like Harvard cannot take all the people who are smart and could be there. And so I wanted to figure out, how do I take this experience of Harvard back to Kenya? And so my idea was, I want to build a world-class university, in Africa at some point. That was the dream that's sort of started to formulate around that experience at Harvard. And what was really neat, honestly, is my learning group was super supportive. I told them about it. They were super supportive. And then I started to share this idea with people. And, I feel like there's ideas out there that you say them and they just sound crazy. like
it's a big idea.
Yeah. And no one dismissed it. And I think that's the magic of being at a place like Harvard is you have people who have space in their imagination for big, bold ambition. And that was really neat. So I'm on this journey. I'm experiencing Harvard. I'm learning a lot more about business, about myself, about my friends and what they want to do. And it's the different range of career options there are. And in your first year of Harvard for the traditional program, you sort of have a set curriculum. So everyone takes the same classes and there's no real specialization, but it's great because that's the foundation that sort of everyone needs as you go through all the topics. In the second year, now you get to start picking the classes that you want to take. And so I remember in that first semester of my second year, I picked a bunch of classes, all great professors. In the second semester, same thing. But in that second semester, I found myself, but let me back up a little bit. So before business school, I think I'd only been to Kenya like one or two times, probably 2 times, I think. And, in a large period of time, right? So, but then once I went to Harvard, I found myself going back to Kenya a lot more frequently. I went back in the summer for a summer internship. I led a group of students to a trek to East Africa, which was actually where I met my co-founder for Sinapis. And so I just kept going back to the continent. And then I went back again in my in that second semester of my senior year. And as I kept going back, I kept having more and more of a pull to do something sooner than 15 years after I graduated business school. And it was during one of those treks where I met my co-founder, where I shared this idea of starting a university. And she had been on her own journey thinking about the space and thinking about angel investing and thinking about what's the impact that she could have. And so that really started forming the beginning of that second semester, us talking about these ideas and what we wanted to do. In that second,
I want to interject a question in there. So you're mentally shifting from the idea that I think a lot of people have of, I've got stirrings in my heart about a difference I want to make. I'm experiencing extreme poverty in a new way. Could be any number of different things. In the initial idea, it sounds like after I've had a lot of financial success, I'm going to invest. I'm going to put in time. I'm going to work to make a difference. Somewhere what you just said is you started to have your mind change to think, feels like maybe this is going to happen soon. What was that like? Or I'm curious for those that are listening to this, because I think a lot of people wrestle with those questions. And maybe on one extreme, people say, well, it's reckless to not seize all the economic opportunity that you can. And Harvard Business School puts you right at the top of the list for that. So I'm just curious how you thought about that, or, maybe what advice you'd give to people who are hearing this and thinking similar thoughts for themselves.
You know what it was? It's that I started to act on that sort of desire to start a school in more concrete ways. And that pull just started growing and growing to the point where you couldn't ignore it. So, in that second semester, you know, Harvard allows you to do these independent field studies where you basically propose a topic, you have a professor sponsor you, and then you go through the topic. And so one of my topics was, what would it take to start a world-class business school in Kenya? And that was my class. I was literally like doing all the research, talking to professors, thinking about what are the economics of starting a new school. What's a world-class school look like? Well, you need great professors. How do you attract those professors? And just starting to think through all the pieces of what it takes to start a world-class business school. And so, I mean, that was a very concrete step towards that idea, right? I mean, it wasn't me committing anything, but it was me saying, well, I have this desire. Let me actually just see what it would take. Well, it turns out to start a world-class university, at least at the time, takes something like $750 million.
Did you not have that readily available? That wasn't...
My credit card limit just wasn't quite that high. And, but it's interesting because, you know, while I was going through school, yes, you're going through and exploring all the traditional paths that people explore in business school. Consulting is a big one, investment banking, and you do think about those career paths. But for me, it's not to say the economics didn't matter, because they still did. And, but the idea was just taking root because I was doing something about it, you know, and I think life is a series of trade-offs. You know, I think that you're always going to be trading off one thing versus another. You're going to be trading off, do I have impact today and maybe not make as much money? Or do I go and make a bunch of money and, you know, backload my impact, as it were? And I don't think one is right or wrong. I think different people have different paths. And there's, you know, if I look at my peers out of business school, people have options that they didn't graduating business school because they picked the path of building economic assets. But for me, it was just taking the step and sort of thinking to myself, okay, I'm just going to be faithful to the step before me. You know, I didn't have some grand plan of starting Sinapis when I graduated. I was doing a lot of work, thinking about Kenya, studying Kenya, and then in those conversations with Courtney on that last semester, just them evolving into, okay, we can't do a world-class university, but what if we do a nonprofit, which doesn't take $750 million. You can do it right away and you can still have pretty important impact.
Yeah.
And so that's what set me on the path. And then as I was thinking about what to do, I ended up getting an HBS leadership fellowship, working at Dillard University in New Orleans. And for me, that opportunity was me continuing to take a step towards a dream of, well, if you want to start a university, good to get experience working at one. And at the time, they were thinking about what would it look like to start a master's, an MBA program, because they had done an undergraduate business program. And so I took that step. And then while I was taking that step, during that year, we were thinking a lot more about, well, this idea of Sinapis and what it could become. And then, I would say life has an interesting way of, I don't know, maybe converging on an outcome, but, I had met my now wife at the time in my last semester of Harvard, cause she was also doing work in Kenya, and we'd been dating. And then she said, hey, I'm moving back to Kenya, but I can't do long distance. And so it was also this other choice. Okay. We ended up on this point of convergence of, okay, we've reached as far as we can do planning Sinapis in the US. And if we're going to do anything, we need to be on the ground. Yeah. And then I've kind of reached the end of this relationship, as it stands now. So there's a choice to make. And so the two kind of converged pretty nicely, where I proposed to my, girlfriend. Fortunately, she said yes. And I moved to Kenya to do Sinapis. And so it was, I don't know that it was this conscious choice to say, I'm not going to do impact 15 years from now. I think it was just me taking sort of like the next step and sort of being faithful to the choices in front of me.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And it resonates with my own story that there wasn't, that I could see, ever a grand plan. And in my 20s, investment management background, trying to navigate how the Lord was leading, it was really being in some ways haunted by what I had seen with extreme poverty that set me down this path of, God, there's got to be new ways, innovative ways to get to the roots of these problems. And I wasn't sure if he wanted me to do that vocationally or not, but it was a whole series of steps, very similar. There was not this blueprint that got handed to me. It was trying to walk in step with him and be faithful. So I'm curious then, in your journey, because you've had a lot of different steps in your career. So you move to Nairobi, you start working with entrepreneurs, you're bootstrapping this thing. I know there was initial investment. It was a huge step of faith, but you and Courtney, there was not a lot of resource backing all of this. So what were those early steps like? But I want to talk about the other steps in your career that you took, because maybe right now, those that are listening think, all of this just leads to everything being up and to the right. You're being faithful, you're surrendering your will to the Lord. That, of course, means everything's going to go just the way that you want.
Oh, absolutely. Very facetious. Absolutely. So, those first steps with Sinapis, and even till now, it's constant step of faith. Everything from trying to get business permits to working on the curriculum and telling people about it. There was just so many different moments where you had to sort of say, okay, I'm just going to be faithful to the thing that's in front of me. And that's the most you can do. And there is a tension, because I think that stewardship demands that you do planning and that you are wise and faithful to the resources that God's given you, whether that's time or money or relationships. And at the same time, you make the plans, but the Lord plans the way. And, so that was all those steps. And I think they were, those first years were really just a continuous step of faith, because we didn't know what Sinapis would really become. Yes, we had a big vision for what it could be, but we didn't know.
What was it like in those first few months? What were you doing?
Oh, scrappy. It was, we land, we're like, okay, great. We need to launch our first class. To launch our first class, we need to have a curriculum. At the time, it was going to be a 16-week mini MBA type of program. And we launched the program, but not the whole curriculum wasn't written. We'd go really early. I think the classes were like at 6:30 or some super early hour, in the morning. 6:30 or 7, you'd go, you'd do the class. And then you'd kind of have the rest of the day. And then I'd be thinking through what's the curriculum that we're going to be teaching next. And, how are we going to teach marketing? How are we going to teach finance? How are we going to teach, sales and going to market? Like all those different things. And then you're trying to make it very practical. You didn't want it to just be an academic setting. You're trying to make it an intensely practical curriculum, because these are real entrepreneurs launching real businesses. And yeah, it was very scrappy. But, the neat thing was that we just got to know each other in a really cool way. We got to know each other as a working team. We got to know the entrepreneurs. We got to see the different businesses that people were running. And, it was incredibly scrappy, but it was also incredibly fulfilling.
Do you have anything? So for the entrepreneurs that are listening, certainly in East Africa, could be in the US or elsewhere, it's scrappy at that level. What are the keys in that phase of a launch in your mind to be successful? Maybe just a couple of them, because obviously there's a lot. What do you think is most important for somebody that's at that phase? Is ideation, we're excited, but
I think it's focus and excellence. You've got to be focused about the thing that you're putting your time and energy into. Like, what's the most important thing you could be doing? And there were so many different fish to fry at that point, but the most important thing for us was delivering a solid experience to the people who were going through the program.
Yeah.
And so we have to be super focused on that. And an excellence, because their experiences with us were going to be the basis of what they told other people and other entrepreneurs and our ability to reach more people. And also just excellence because they were trusting, in some sense, part of their business and part of their resources with us.
Sure.
And so certainly they were devoting a ton of time to the process. And so we had to really show up, whether that was in the classroom setting, in the field as we were with them on their business, or just the relational component of it. We just had to be there. And so I think when you're starting out, there's so many different things you could be doing, but really thinking about how do you stay focused and how do you deliver excellence? Because that's the thing that's going to that's going to be the key to unlocking each of the next phases of the journey. So, yeah.
And so, and I think you guys did that really successfully. Again, whenever I tell the story of Sinapis, first began accelerating entrepreneurs in 2011. I joined in 2016, planned transition. I mean, now, by God's grace, we're working in 17 countries around the world. We've trained and accelerated over 4,000 entrepreneurs. But you've told me in the past, I think the phrase you used is you can only train and accelerate entrepreneurs in entrepreneurship so long before maybe you start getting bit by that bug. So what happened? Because you moved on to some other things. I'd love to hear the steps in your entrepreneurial journey and business career.
Yeah. So, I've been doing Sinapis for a few years, and, as you teach entrepreneurship, you eventually want to do it because I don't know, I'm a builder. I feel like I'm called to build things. I'm a terrible maintainer, and I still had this desire to continue having an impact on the continent. And I was thinking, well, how do I do it? And, for some reason, capital has always been part of my heart. And how do I think about capital? And at the time, this continues to be a big issue today, but, entrepreneurs need capital, and getting that capital in Kenya is incredibly difficult. But if you can use data to de-risk capital, then you can have a lot of impact. And so that led me to basically make a decision to leave Sinapis on an operating basis and to do a startup called a fintech startup. And this time I was going solo, so I didn't have a partner, and it was just a vision of I think we can start basically a firm that uses data to help give people capital. And so that was a journey I decided to go on.
Can I double click on that? Can you say a little bit more about why capital is so important, why it's hard to secure, and what that has to do with financial management and data?
Yeah. So, I mean, cash is the lifeblood of every business, right? And if you go back to that, time when I was in Kidera talking to that young man who needed a job, capital is what helps unlock things like jobs. And because businesses hire people, and to hire people, you need to have money. You need to be able to make payroll. And for a lot of businesses out there, they may generate cash flow, but for a lot of businesses, you're generating cash flows, with sort of a negative working capital cycle. So you have to buy the inventory, you have to sell it, and then you get paid. And, sometimes you get paid right away. Sometimes you get paid on 30 days, 90 days, whatever the case might be. And in that period, a lot of people need capital. Or you might need capital because you have a good business. You have one location, let's say, and now you want to expand to the next location. So now you need capital investments to go out and retrofit a new store and all the rest. And, Africa has no shortage of talent, no shortage of opportunity, but what it doesn't have is a really efficient way to allocate capital, like tons of capital, to a lot of people. There's tons of entrepreneurs really across the range of entrepreneurship, from small micro finance type people that you think of all the way to large and growing businesses whose revenues can comprise a meaningful percentage of economic activity in the country. And so you need capital, right? And by the way, that's not unique to Africa. That's across the entire world. In the US, the main difference is in places like the US and Europe. We have really good infrastructure to assess the risk of of lending that capital. So, if I'm a small business owner today, I probably use QuickBooks. And because QuickBooks is integrated with my bank and my credit card statements and invoices, this deep integration. If I need money, I can probably pretty easily get that money, either because, QuickBooks has relationships with lenders, or in some cases can lend me the money themselves. And it's really easy. Or you have things like credit bureaus who can look at, do you pay back your money? And based on that, they can give you money. So we have really good infrastructure in places like the US and Europe and other parts of the world. But that infrastructure also doesn't exist in other places. And in Kenya, it just doesn't exist. And so getting the money you need to start a business is really hard.
Yeah. So if I'm tracking, and these are all my convictions as well, you look at the things that break our heart, like extreme poverty. You spend time in Kibera, it marks you.
Yes.
But then to connect dots to things like gifted entrepreneurs that can grow companies, create and sustain jobs. But one of the most essential things that they need is capital, whether it's working capital or growth capital, to grow those ventures and make sure they're strong. And the ecosystem built around the talent in the West is robust.
Very robust.
But in a lot of places where you've got unbelievable talent, unbelievable opportunity, and we see those levels of deprivation, we've got some of those systems around them that are broken. And that, in so many reasons, is why Sinapis exists, but it's also why you created Caytree. So can you speak to Caytree? But I want you to talk about the journey with Caytree and what it was like for you as a founder, solo founder.
Yeah. So Caytree was interesting, right? Because I'd been teaching entrepreneurship this whole time, and that was time to go do it. And it was interesting because, I worked on Caytree for 5 years, and ultimately it didn't work for a number of reasons I can get to. But the thing that Caytree was trying to fundamentally solve was an incredibly challenging problem, which is how do you de-risk? How do you remove the information asymmetry that stops a lender from giving to a potential entrepreneur and knowing that they're going to get their money back with enough of a probability that they're willing to make that bet, right? And so fundamentally, you're looking at building this infrastructure in the country. And that's what I was trying to do. And one of the things we teach in Sinapis is you've got to rapidly make pivots. And so, there were so many things I learned as an entrepreneur, but the thing I kept trying to do is make a bunch of pivots. And also really sort of like being scrappy as an entrepreneur, trying to use the resources I had wisely, trying to develop local talent. So if I think about what are some key lessons that I took away from that time at Caytree, from a business perspective, it's continue to iterate and iterate quickly and try to see like how you can make an impact. I think in retrospect, I probably tried to bite off more, than was potentially possible, to do. If I think about it, towards the end of my time at Caytree, I had this incredible idea and I was like, gosh, I wish I had had this idea 3 years ago, because then I think I would have had the time and resources to execute on it. And I just fundamentally didn't.
Yeah.
But I think another lesson from Caytree is, for entrepreneurs, I think the overwhelming reality of entrepreneurship is that you're going to fail. So if you decide that you're going to start a business, it's a little bit like getting in your car to go somewhere and someone telling you like you have a 1 in 10 chance of getting to where you want to go. And you have to be a little bit rational as a person to take on entrepreneurship, because you're basically thinking to yourself, I am going to be the person who has a 1 in 10 chance of getting there. But I don't think a lot of entrepreneurs really grapple with the idea that they might actually fail if they start something.
How did it feel for you? Because of course you're going in saying, yeah, I'm going to be in the 10%. So how did it feel? And I don't know if this felt like the first thing in your life you had put your hand to that didn't work, but what was that like for you?
Gosh, so many emotions. I'll give you a sampling of them. The first one was, how is it that I taught entrepreneurship and now I'm failing? That was the first immediate question.
Yeah.
The second was, I'm not a quitter. And so that's part of why I rationally went on for so long. I probably, maybe you could have made the argument, should have quit 2 or 3 years in. But there was this very visceral identity piece of like, I am not a quitter. And, you read all the stories of people who were persistent and kept going. And I think as an entrepreneur, you have to kind of know what your line is. Yeah. You have to know like just how irrationally are you going to pursue a goal?
How do you figure that out? Do you have any advice for those that may be in that situation, or is it so unique to each individual?
I do think it is. I do think it's unique. In my specific case, it just started having all these massively negative impacts on my family, on my marriage. And I got to this fork in the road where, Caytree wasn't dead. In fact, I'd been accepted to an accelerator that would have demanded me sort of taking 4 months away from my family. And, I think there was the case to be made that if I'd gone to the accelerator, it would have sort of injected the exact sort of like energy and capital and resources I needed to finally make it work. But on the other side of that ledger was this question of, well, what's it going to cost me in terms of my family, in terms of my marriage? And is that a trade I'm willing to make? And so I think as an entrepreneur, you have to have, I would say, going into a business, you have to be really clear with yourself. What's the line that says, I can go up to this far, but I can't go past that? Because if you don't have that line set going into it, that line is going to keep moving when you're in it.
Well, it brings to mind the significant other covenant, right? Or contract
Right.
that we
Right.
introduce in the curriculum, which is this idea of, I mean, hopefully before you even launch, how do you think through those things? If God has given you a spouse, or I suppose it could be a business partner, or if it's someone really important in your life, and how do we try to get on the same page? And that's a really practical idea that sounds like you got to that point and had clarity.
It did, and I would say there's seasons to entrepreneurship and seasons to when you can and can't do it. At the time that I was starting Caytree, we didn't have kids. My wife and I didn't have kids. And then we had kids in the middle of that journey, and the season changed and it couldn't sustain the journey anymore. And I think you have to be really honest about that. Because for me, the red line was there's this hierarchy of, my relationship with the Lord is something I'm not going to compromise. Then my marriage is not something I want to compromise, or marriage/family. And so entrepreneurship for me kind of sat below those things. So for me, that was the line, is just, there was a cost that I wasn't willing to go past. And I think looking back, certainly no one could accuse me of not having been committed or tried enough. So,
Oh yeah.
So at some point, I think the story, you have to go from I'm not a quitter to, hey, sometimes you have to take a tactical retreat and try again. And what's interesting about that, Matthew, is actually, my wife and I shortly after moved back to the US, and I was having dinner with an old, mentor of mine, and, we're having lunch in San Francisco, and someone came into the table and he introduced, you knew him. And so he said, hey, this is my friend Karibu. He's just come back from Kenya and entrepreneurship. And I think he's gonna put a little bit more money in the bank before he gets back at it again, which is a really funny thing to say. But I think he definitely, he definitely kind of like hit the nail on the head on just some of my personality around entrepreneurship.
Yeah. Well, part of what I love that you just talked about, you use the word identity. So finding identity rooted in the Lord. And then I think the wisdom of the priorities of spouse and family, and just, whether it was all perfect in the timing or not, that you had reached the point where you said, this season can change. And I've known you throughout that period. I remember when you were evaluating that accelerator, and I think it's a strong testament to God's hand in your life and your faithfulness. And that led to a startup with Google and a time at Meta and all kinds of very senior leadership roles. And I mean, the Lord continues to use you, now involved in another startup. But I think maybe as we move toward wrapping up here, I'm curious how you feel about entrepreneurship on the continent of Africa. Where do you think some of this is going? I mean, you continue the chairman of the board at Sinapis. You're still integrally helping to lead in the work that we do. But where do you see things going? It's a really big question that you could take any number of directions. But where do you think things are going on the continent? What role does entrepreneurship play? Maybe for those that would be listening to this from the West and saying, hey, you just said it was only 1 in 10 that probably succeed. Why would I be excited about entrepreneurship? This just sounds like a really hard, difficult road.
Entrepreneurship is hard, but it's also incredibly powerful. I'm not a musician, and so this analogy may or may not work. But think about if you get 100 musicians in a room and you tell them, hey, come up with like a great song and play it and make it sound good. Well, that seems kind of daunting because lots of instruments, lots of people, lots of personalities and egos and just all the rest. But when it comes together into this orchestra, it's incredibly beautiful. And it just kind of illustrates the power of what it looks like when things really kind of gel. And entrepreneurship is like that, but on such a deeper and more impactful level, because when you start a business, Sinapis is about planting the seed. If you plant that seed and it grows, right? And you start to see a business come to life. You start to see a community form in a company around people who are focused on delivering value to the marketplace and doing it with excellence and doing it with a sense of service. There's beauty in that, because now you're delivering something that the marketplace needs. And because that's what entrepreneurship is ultimately. You're seeing a need that's not being met, and you're figuring out, how do I deliver that need in a sustainable way?
Right.
And that when that comes together, it's beautiful, because then you have a healthy community in a company that grows. You have that young man with the opportunity to get a job. Once he has a job, is an opportunity to provide for his family.
Yeah.
And then you have the suppliers, and you have just the entire ecosystem. When entrepreneurship works, is powerful. But that's just the first part. I think the other reason entrepreneurship is particularly powerful in places like Africa and other frontier markets is, I think there's still a social contract being written between entrepreneurs and businesses and the country, around what is an obligation of a business to society.
Yeah.
And I don't think it's just making money. I think it's making money. I think it's, having real values around community and service and excellence. And when it comes together, it just works really, really well.
Yeah.
I think, Africa is the youngest continent, right? It's the youngest continent in terms of, if you look at the demographics, it has the highest number of young people across the world. And if you think generationally, if you think about what it means to invest in sort of like the next 20 years, 40 years in the next generation, like, there is nothing more important you can do than create jobs for people to have. And we resonate with this implicitly, right? We resonate with this because whether you're a nurse, whether you're a college professor, whether you're a mechanic, whether you're a baker, an accountant, a lawyer, like, all those jobs come from institutions that are propped up to some degree by entrepreneurs. Right. Even the academic ones and the hospitals, like, all those things are underwritten by business.
When I'm trying to help people understand this, you think every single local church, ministry, nonprofit, and ultimately government exist financially because of what entrepreneurs create. That free cash flow.
And I'll say this, the history of the U.S. is fundamentally entrepreneurs, whether that was in the 1800s and 1900s, the 20th century, it's the history of entrepreneurs who've had small businesses, and those businesses have created neighborhood jobs. They've created jobs across the country. Some of our biggest companies today started as small businesses that just grew. And so I think that's incredibly powerful that you have that, and you have to invest in that next generation. And I think the thing I kind of sort of like want to end on this point of what does entrepreneurship mean is, for Africa, or really all these other frontier markets, is, you're fundamentally partnering with the Lord, whether you're a secular entrepreneur or whether you're a faith-driven entrepreneur, but you are partnering with something that the Lord has created that helps affirm the worth of human beings by giving people the dignity to earn a living, the dignity to provide for their family, the dignity to contribute to society. And the thing that I think is easy to lose sight of is entrepreneurship is such a lonely journey. Mm-hmm. And if you're that person who's embarked on that journey and you have a 1 in 10 shot, how much do you need people to come alongside you? Whether that's an organization like Sinapis giving you the skills and equipping you for the journey, whether it's fellow entrepreneurs, whether it's someone in a far off land who decides that they're going to support a nonprofit doing this work, right? You don't have to do it yourself, but like we can come alongside entrepreneurs and we can help them on this journey because it's incredibly lonely. But when it works, it is like that orchestra that just is beautiful.
Yeah, no, that's so good. I mean, one other image that comes to mind is the name of the organization that you and Courtney founded. Sinapis comes from the Latin word for the mustard seed. And one of the amazing things when Jesus taught about that is he said, when that seed grows to become the largest plant in the garden, this beautiful picture of the birds coming and making nests in the branches. And that is what you just described. When people find good, stable jobs, when disposable incomes rise, when they can provide for their children, when they get to make decisions about the food on the table and education and healthcare, all the things that all of us want. And you see so much of how God has ordained that is rooted in a founder who takes on the kind of risks that you've taken on and so many others have for the flourishing of employees and dependents and supply chains. And it's just this really, really beautiful part of how God's kingdom comes. So I'm super grateful for you. Thanks for coming on today. Thank you for your faithfulness over all these years, for really traveling a different path than probably what most people would, and being faithful through the whole journey with startups and large corporates and all the ways that God has used you. Just grateful for you and thankful to all of you that would join in on this. We hope that this is an encouragement to you. We love sharing these stories, and this has just been a blessing. So thanks, Karibu, for joining today.
Thank you, Matthew.